I'm David Pace. I'm a professor emeritus at Indiana University. I taught there for 40 years, starting in 1971. And I've been involved for the last 20 years, really, with the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, although I didn't know it was the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning when I started. I focused on modern France intellectual in history, and my teaching was fairly broad. I taught, of course, for years on the culture of Paris and Berlin in the 1920s. I taught the history survey. I taught, of course, on the history of the future, things like that. When I started teaching in 1971, I had absolutely no idea of what I was doing. I'd had zero training, not 1 minute of training in history, and walked into a large class without any idea of what I should do, and more importantly, without an idea that there was something I could learn from somebody else. I thought it was all about figuring it out on my own and having some charisma and knowing the subject matter. And it took years before I got past that point. I made all the mistakes myself. There's that great Niels Bohr quote that an expert is somebody that makes all possible mistakes in a limited field. So I am obviously an expert in history teaching. I always enjoyed teaching, but I got increasingly frustrated by the fact that students weren't getting things that I wanted to teach that were terribly important to me. And so I started working with a colleague, and that was extremely important that I wasn't doing it alone. And I started working with someone from the School of Education who was helping people. And I began to understand that there's some things I could learn, things I could read. There was theory. And we began working on a simulation. We redid the history survey in Europe. And in the process, I slowly began to realize that this was an area just like my research in which I could learn things from other people, in which knowledge counted. Several things happened as I began doing this process. One of the most important things was, since I wasn't working alone, I was articulating what I was doing, and I was listening to what other people were doing, and that was absolutely essential to the process. And I was reading things and getting more sophistication about who the students were, and beginning to realize how difficult this material that I was trying to teach was for many of them. One of the things that's been essential to my work is the slow realization that what's natural to us is not natural to students. That we have embedded in our minds all sorts of patterns of thinking and operating that we don't teach to students because they're so obvious. And it took me years working on my own to begin to understand what some of those things were. That when I ask a student, for example, to read a statement and say, do you agree or disagree, discuss, that required a whole series of cognitive operations that I began to realize that students didn't necessarily have. I read research on the students at Harvard and found that in their senior year, most of them had just barely made it to the point of being able to process questions like that. And here I was at a large state university assuming that on the essay exams. And I realized increasingly that I was being part of a system of inequality that I didn't like. That some of the students were coming into the classes prepared, trained, they were educationally advantaged, and others were not. And then as a colleague said, I was sorting them. I was deciding who already had the abilities and who didn't, giving them grades, and reinforcing all the unfairness that had preceded me. So the task became for me to figure out how to take students who hadn't been prepared, who hadn't had the opportunities, and give them the chance to gain some of those in my class. I think that students are emerging from classes further along. There's only so much you can do in a single class. But in my classes and the people that I work with, we're seeing students who start this semester with fundamental deficits beginning to gain some of the things that they need to think more creatively and actively and to be citizens beyond our classroom. And so, yes, we're beginning to see that. And I think that's what we have to do. I think we have a moral responsibility to the society as historians to help people learn to do the kinds of thinking that we do, because it matters. It's not just an esoteric thing. This is a crucial part of being a citizen and of functioning in the world. Plus, we do so much damage to students when we teach them badly. They come in with their hopes. Many of them have spent their entire lives being told they're stupid and that they don't matter. and they come into our class, and if we tell them once again that that's true, we've done great damage to them. We've also done damage to the society, because there are things they might have been able to do and give to our world and to understand in ways that are very important. And if we don't do something to change that, if students leave our class the way they came in, we've done something serious to them and to the society. It's interesting that as historians, sometimes we forget about history, and we assume that the structures we have for doing our research, the refereed journals, all of the mechanisms we have for doing quality research, we tend to take that as a natural fact. You can measure, you can evaluate, you can build on research, but teaching is different. Well, as historians, we should know that all those structures were created in the last 150 years. That there was a time when deciding who got to stay in a department or who got promoted, et cetera, was on, who liked George down the row. But we developed processes to regularize that and to share it so that we could share what other people were doing. I mean, to do our research without a mechanism for finding out what other people have done in the field would be insane. We haven't got that for history, or we're just beginning to get it in our history teaching. And I think we can begin to construct patterns that reproduce some of that collective endeavor that we have in our research in the field of teaching. I think the AHA could be a crucial place for this. So it involves a forum for the exchange of ideas, ways in which people can learn about the approaches, the methodologies other people are using, in which they can share their own experiences with each other, in which we can begin to decide that certain approaches make more sense than others, or we can be very specific about the conditions under which using a particular teaching technique is advisable, and when it's probably not the most useful way to do that. So I think the AHA can have a really important role in creating the kind of social and institutional and professional environment in which we can bring to teaching some of the kind of intellectual rigor that we have always had we've had in our research for the last century. In the late 1990s, a number of things were coming together. Discussions of teaching, a sense that we needed to take it more seriously, but also a shift to learning, focused on not just on what we did, but how students took it in, what they brought to the classroom, et cetera. That was out there. And the Carnegie Endowment for the Advancement of Education created a kind of think tank called CASTLE, Carnegie Academy for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. And one of the first topics that they took up was history. And so a group of us were invited to Palo Alto 2 summers and began to network. It was a brilliant program. And from that center, connections were made, and people began projects, but they also began working together, becoming aware of each other's work. And so coming out of that, a group of us met at an AHA conference in Washington about 10 years ago and said, we need to have some kind of society. And there had been, in the meantime, an International Society for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning created, and it continues, and it meets all over the world in annual meetings. And we wanted to create a special group of historians. And so we did that. We have a newsletter. We have around 350 members in, I think, 12 countries. And in the last year, we've become an affiliate organization of the American Historical Association. So we're hoping that working through the AHA, we can have sessions, workshops, because we know that there's many, many historians out there who are frustrated with what they're doing and are finding what they're doing right now is not working. And on the other side, there's fascinating research being done by a number of people into what works in the history classroom. And so I think the AHA is an ideal place to bring these two things together. One of the things that's been most exciting in the last several years is, of course, the tuning movement. And the possibilities of interactions there are enormous, because tuning, at least in this United States context, has done a very fine job of mobilizing people and also articulating what's important about history. But by and large, they've worked on the basis of their own sort of classroom knowledge and experience. The Scholarship of Teaching and Learning has tended to develop models and ideas and concepts about learning in the history classroom. But we've not done much organizing, and we've not reached out to the broader society. And I think the two groups coming together could help each other so much. So I'm hoping that in the next several years, we'll see more and more collaboration between those two groups, which unfortunately have been rather separate from each other. They developed independently. I think it's now time, and I think many people in tuning feel that as well, that it's time for us to come together and see what we can do. In the discussions about teaching and learning in the late 1980s and 1990s, increasingly people began to realize that all learning is local. It's disciplinary specific. Lee Shulman, who became director of the Carnegie Endowment, was one of the leaders in this, and he talked about disciplinary pedagogies that we have to know about. In fact, and he carried the message that we've got to think about what it means to learn history, not what it means to learn in general. And as a natural step, it made sense to bring people from the disciplines into the work. And so that began to happen in the late 1990s, and that was one of the goals of the Carnegie Academy. And so all of us working in the field are trying to think as historians, operating in history, and in the language that historians recognize. We don't want to simply take language from another field and try to impose it, try to be a kind of social scientists that we're not. But on the other hand, we also have access to some very, very creative work that's been done by people in the field of education, by educational researchers, particularly in the K-12 area. And so part of our job is to take those ideas and then play with them, see how they're particularly relevant to history, and then to operate as historians. And one of the great advantages we have over people in other disciplines is what we do in our research is very close to what we do in the scholarship of teaching and learning. We deal with people, look at change, we look at groups. We're used to that language and those things, so we don't have to do a lot of transition. And then we produce things that are recognizable to historians and that we share. So we're operating as historians, but we're also drawing upon the knowledge that's been developed in education schools. And a lot of it's very, very important. And also by high school teachers, because that split between K-12 and college is completely dysfunctional. And we have something to learn from them, and I think they have something to learn from us as well. In my own work, which has been highly collaborative, we focused on what historians in particular, and people in other fields as well, take for granted in their teaching. What we found is one of the reasons students aren't learning is that the professional, as an expert, automatically does some of the most essential operations without even being conscious of them. So we systematically start off and try to find where are those places in learning where it's not happening, where there are bottlenecks. And then we process those. We talk to people in the field and we say, when you do this thing that the students have trouble with doing, what do you do? And then we keep going deeper and deeper, saying, how do you do that? How do you do that? How do you do that? Until we've made explicit the steps that students have to take to get past that bottleneck. And then we try to model those. We give students practice at it. We deal with emotional obstacles. We assess how much each of those pieces has been learned by the students. Then we go back and redo it, those parts that haven't been successful. And then we share with other people. And this process we've called Decoding the Disciplines. And so we have a group on my campus, the History Learning Project, that's been working for 10 years, interviewing historians, exploring possibilities for teaching some of the operations that we've not been teaching, focusing on what students have to do, not what students have to know, and then figuring out what are the most effective ways to give students those skills. And it's getting a good response. There's people, I think, in 10 countries now using this method, developing it, taking it their own directions. And we hope to be publishing a book soon on history in which we go through this process and show other people what we've learned and hopefully invite them into trying it themselves. There's the question of why a historian should care about all this. Because we all love our research, we love our areas, we love those topics that we spend our lives going into that nobody else knows about except 5 other people. So why should this stuff matter? There's a number of reasons. I mean, one, there's the big idealistic reason that what we do is crucial. The society needs us. the future needs us. If you have kids, it matters whether people are learning history or not, because the kinds of thinking that we do are essential to survival in the kind of world we live in. We can't continue to have a population that doesn't understand about big questions of institutions and change and alteration, because that's what it is. But back to the personal level, I think most of us teach. At least all of us in the university teach. And it's very, very frustrating to go into the classroom with things that you love, that you care about, that you want to share, and have it not work. And it's also professionally dysfunctional. It drains energy, particularly young faculty. I think that not being trained and prepared in graduate programs for the future job of teaching actually hurts research, because those first years people are floundering. I remember how hard it was for me my first year, trying to figure out answers, et cetera. And they can't continue their research agenda effectively because they're emotionally and practically obsessed with trying to solve teaching problems that have been solved 50 times over by other people. So I think that providing this kind of background to new historians is going to actually help their research, because it's going to allow them to do their other functions in a way that makes them feel better about themselves and takes less time. So I think that to avoid the frustration, knowing something about what works and what doesn't work, to avoid having to recreate all of that knowledge that is out there and people don't know about right now, that's all dysfunctional for the profession. So I think it really matters for people to begin to take as part of their professional identity, learning how to do part of the job that they do systematically and not doing it off the cuff and making it all up as they go along. So I think all of us can benefit from this operation. So it's not abandoning your research. It's not saying it's not important. It's saying it is important and I want to share it. And that I need to learn a process for how to do that most effectively, just as I learn a process in my research for how to do it.